No, Aaron Russo.
I met Rockefeller through a female attorney I knew who called me up one day and said, one of the Rockefellers would like to meet you. I had made a video called Mad as Hell, and he'd seen the video and wanted to meet me and knew I was running for governor of Nevada. So sure, I'd love to meet him. And I met him and I liked him, and he was a very, very smart man. And we used to talk and share ideas and thoughts. And he's the one who told me 11 months before 9/11 ever happened that there was going to be an event. Never told me what the event was going to be, but there was going to be an event. And out of that event, we were going to invade Afghanistan to run pipelines from the Caspian Sea. We were going to invade Iraq, you know, to take over the oil fields, establish a base in the Middle East, and make it all part of the New World Order. And we'd go after Chavez in Venezuela. And sure enough, later 9/11 happened. And I remember he was telling me how how you're going to see soldiers looking in caves for people in Afghanistan and Pakistan and all these places. And there's going to be this war on terror, which is no real enemy. And the whole thing is a giant hoax, you know, but it's a way for the government to take over the American people.
He told you it was going to be a hoax.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. There's no question. He says, there's going to be war on terror. And he's just laughing. There's no, who are we fighting? I mean, why do you think 9/11 happened and then nothing's happened since then? Do you think that our security is so great here that these people who pulled off 9/11, who were able to, can't knock down another plane? Come on, it's ridiculous. 9/11 was done by people in our own government and our own banking system to perpetuate the fear of the American people into subordinating themselves to anything the government wants them to do. That's what it's about, and to create this war, this endless war on terror. And that's why and that was the first lie. And the next lie was going into Iraq, you know, to get Saddam Hussein out with his weapons of mass destruction. That was the next lie.
Now, specifically, this was a little over 6 years ago.
This was
11 months before 9/11.
Yeah.
And Nick Rockefeller, who's a lawyer, he's become your friend over the previous years, and he's saying to you that there's going to be this big event, and then out of that we're going to have a war on terror, and it's just going to go on and on.
Right, an endless war on terror without any real enemy. That you can never, so you can never define a winner.
And did he say that it's going to be perfect because you can't define an enemy? It just goes on and on?
Yeah, because you can't define a winner. There's no one to beat, so it goes on and on forever. And they can do whatever they want. They scare the hell out of the American public. Look, this whole war on terror is a fraud. It's a farce. It's very difficult to say it out loud because people are intimidated against saying it. Because if you say it, they want to make you into a nutcase. But the truth has to come out. That's why I'm doing this interview. The fact of the matter happens to be that the whole war on terror is a fraud. It's a farce. Yeah, there's a war going on in Iraq because we invaded Iraq. And people over there fighting, you know. But the war on terror, that's a joke, you know. And until we discover what really happened on 9/11 and who was responsible for 9/11, because that's where the war on terror emanates from. That's where it comes from. It was 9/11 that allowed this war on terror to begin. And until we get to the bottom root of 9/11, the truth of 9/11, we'll never know about the war on terror.
Aaron, you said that he was...
There's a segment here that I'm going to quote rather than play it because I do have some time constraints. Aaron says that, or asked the question of Nick Rockefeller, well, what about all the people who are left behind? And Rockefeller says, why do you care about them? Take care of your own, take care of your family, and don't worry about the others. Russo's mindset was sufficiently communitarian rather than individualistic that he could not take that point of view. But it's interesting that Aaron brings that up because the people who are in the ruling elite are perfectly happy to let the rest of the human race, or the Americans, or whatever other group, community you're talking about, go down the toilet as long as their inside group are taken care of.
Who is Russo?
Aaron Russo was a filmmaker who made several, I don't want to call them documentary, films challenging one or another public problem. Not unlike Oliver Stone or Michael Moore. I cannot quote any of the films that he's written, but he was clearly good at business. He tells the story, and these are, by the way, available on YouTube. He tells a story about when he was managing a nightclub in Chicago and how he found out that Chicago politics were as crooked as a dog's hind leg, and that the only way he could survive by managing his nightclub in Chicago was by going along enough so that the police would let him alone, because if he didn't, his place was going to be unprotected. Just put it that way.
In this, he said he was running for governor of Nevada, too.
Right. He was both good at business and good at what is currently called public relations, which is probably why he was being recruited to join the elite. Because as another film, we should sit for the whole documentary sometime, and maybe in the next few weeks. I have a documentary put out by Louis Lapham called The American Ruling Class. And Lapham is an honest member of what used to be the ruling class. He kind of walked away from it either through becoming a mature human being, maybe a little bit in disgust. But in any case, he casts a very analytical eye at how the ruling class is established, how they invite new people in, and how they basically kind of let people who have gone out of their prime, let them go. Kissinger and Brzezinski are still part of the ruling class. There are people whose families have made a lot of money, but they themselves are no longer in the ruling class. They're no longer making decisions. But the fact that Russo points this out is pertinent to one of the two things that I want to chat with you today. Because I have two vignettes. I have a lot of information on one and incomplete information on the other. The first one, and Dawn, you can quote this. The first one is the darkest of the dark scenes, and the second one has to do with a small flashlight that you want to hold on. In 1985, a chartered aircraft, DC-8, crashed on takeoff from Gander, Newfoundland. It was carrying 248 members of the 101st Airborne Division, and it had a crew of 8, which makes 256 persons. And the official cause of the crash was icing on the leading edge of the wing and the top surface of the wing, and unanticipated weight in the bottom portion of the aircraft. It was one of the worst accidents in military transport history, and that's about as much information as you would have read in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune. What makes this episode interesting, both in terms of this class and in terms of the deep state, is connected with the frame of reference of the people who actually make decisions. It is with reference to that frame of mind that I want to quote a little portion of James Corbett's film on the elite are psychopaths. James entitles this, "Our Leaders Are Psychopaths." I'm not going to play a lot, it's entirely too long, but I'll play enough so that you get the idea.
You're listening to the Corbett Report. CorbettReport.com.
Psychopathy, like schizophrenia, is one of those psychological disorders that have entered into the popular vernacular despite the fact that most people don't know what it means. Taking a cue from episode 88 of the Corbett Report podcast, You Are Being Programmed, it seems that we've been programmed to associate psychopathy with this.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Like every good lie, the misconception that all psychopaths are deranged serial killers and likely cannibals has an element of truth to it, insofar as it is easily enough demonstrable that psychopaths are overrepresented in the penal system, and yes, of course, many of the famous serial killers from history have been clinical psychopaths, such as a Ted Bundy, for example. But of course, elementary logic tells us that just because many criminals and serial killers are in fact psychopaths, does not mean that all psychopaths are criminals and serial killers. In fact, what's even more disturbing is the idea that there are many psychopaths that we encounter in our daily lives without ever knowing that these people are in fact psychopathic. This, of course, starts to get into the area of what exactly is a psychopath anyway, and how exactly do you tell if someone is a psychopath? Well, for the past 4 decades, the person that most people have turned to for that answer is Dr. Robert Hare. He is a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia and a renowned psychopathologist and psychophysiologist who helped develop the clinical diagnostic test for psychopathy almost 35 years ago. Dr. Hare's very informative website on the subject can be found at hare.org, and on there you'll find a link to some articles that have been written about Dr. Hare's work, including an article called Psychopaths Among Us by Robert Hirsch. And I'd like to quote from that article. Quote, "Like every scientist, Hare likes a good puzzle, and that was reason enough to make a career out of psychopaths. These were particularly interesting human beings," he said. "Everything about them seemed to be paradoxical. They could do things a lot of other people could not do. Lie, steal, rape, murder. But they looked perfectly normal, and when you talked to them, they seemed okay. It was a puzzle. I thought I'd try and unravel it." Hare arrived at UBC in 1963, intending to follow up his doctoral research on punishment. Certain prisoners, it was rumored, didn't respond to punishment, and Hare went to the federal penitentiary in New Westminster, British Columbia, to find these extreme cases. He found plenty. In his chilling 1993 book on psychopathy, Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us, he quotes one specimen's memories. "My mother, the most beautiful person in the world, she was strong. She worked hard to take care of 4 kids. A beautiful person. I started stealing her jewelry when I was in the 5th grade. You know, I never really knew the bitch. We went our separate ways." For his first paper, now a classic, Hare had his subjects watch a countdown timer. When it reached 0, they got a harmless but painful electric shock, while an electrode taped to their fingers measured perspiration. Normal people would start sweating as the countdown proceeded, nervously anticipating the shock. Psychopaths didn't sweat. They didn't fear punishment, which presumably also holds true outside the laboratory. In Without Conscience, he quotes a psychopathic rapist explaining why he finds it hard to empathize with his victims. They are frightened, right? But you see, I don't really understand it. I've been frightened myself, and it wasn't unpleasant. In another Hare study, groups of letters were flashed to volunteers. Some of them were nonsense, some formed real words. The subject's job was to press a button whenever he recognized a real word, while Hare recorded response time and brain activity. Non-psychopaths respond faster and display more brain activity when processing emotionally loaded words, such as rape or cancer, than when they see neutral words, such as tree. With psychopaths, Hare found no difference. To them, rape and tree have the same emotional impact. None. Hare made another intriguing discovery by observing the hand gestures, called beats, people make while speaking. Research has shown that such gestures do more than add visual emphasis to our words. Many people gesture while they're on the telephone, for example. It seems they actually help our brains find words. That's why the frequency of beats increases when someone is having trouble finding words or is speaking a second language instead of his or her mother tongue. In a 1991 paper, Hare and his colleagues reported that psychopaths, especially when talking about things they should find emotional, such as their families, produce a higher frequency of beats than normal people. It's as if emotional language is a second language, a foreign language in effect, to the psychopath. 3 decades of these studies, by Hare and others, has confirmed that psychopaths' brains work differently from ours, especially when processing emotion and language. Hare once illustrated this for Nicole Kidman, who had invited him to Hollywood to help her prepare for a role as a psychopath in Malice. How, she wondered, could she show the audience there was something fundamentally wrong with her character? I said, "Here's a scene that you can use," Hare says. "You're walking down a street, and there's an accident. A car has hit a child in the crosswalk. A crowd of people gather around. You walk up. The child's lying on the ground, and there's blood running all over the place. You get a little blood on your shoes, and you look down and say, 'Oh shit.' You look over at the child, kind of interested, but you're not repelled or horrified. You're just interested. Then you look at the mother, and you're really fascinated by the mother, who's emoting, crying out, doing all these different things. After a few minutes, you turn away and go back to your house. You go into the bathroom and practice mimicking the facial expressions of the mother." He then pauses and says, "That's the psychopath. Somebody who doesn't understand what's going on emotionally, but understands that something important has happened." End quote. Obviously, this is a fascinating subject, made all the more fascinating by the fact that it's only been seriously scientifically studied for about...
There's an interesting book on the same subject that is quite difficult to read. It's called Political Ponerology. Ponerology is the study of evil. And it was written by a psychiatrist from Eastern Europe. I don't recall exactly which country, but he and his colleagues made evaluations over a span of several decades of Soviet leadership and Eastern European leadership, and made the observation that these people were fundamentally lacking in empathy. And obviously, when Corbett is talking about psychopathy, he's talking about people who have an intrinsic inability to empathize with other human beings. And that may, in fact, be a true and discernible psychopathic condition. I look at certain kinds of situations, however, and have become aware that it is also possible for people to drift into, if not an embrace of that empathy-less condition, at least to accept it and tolerate it in some segmented and walled-off portion of their lives. Catherine Austin Fitts, when she was working on Wall Street, observed that virtually everybody she met was reasonably nice. She worked at an investment firm. I can't dredge up the name off the top of my head, but these investors and manipulators of currency and manipulators of finance were screwing companies, retirement funds, blind. They were defrauding cities who were investing their employees' funds, and A, they seemed perfectly nice and reasonable people, and B, they felt no qualms of conscience about what they were doing. Now, it may be that all of the people, or almost all of the people working on Wall Street are in fact psychopaths in the sense that James Corbett is talking about them, but it may also be, and I strongly suspect that the latter is the case, that a person can learn to ignore what their mother and father taught them and wall off a section of their lives so that in that section of their lives, the rules that they were taught in normal society simply don't apply. The suicide rate in our current crop of veterans from the War on Terror would suggest that although a lot of people are able to wall that off, a significant percentage of them are wounded. They're wounded psychologically, and that wound rises to the surface sometimes sooner, sometimes later, and the only way to eradicate the wound is to destroy themselves. Because right now I believe the War on Terror veterans are destroying themselves at a rate of about 20 per day, is it, Joe?
22.
22 per day. I cannot tell you how or why some segment of the poor population can do that effectively. It may be that the Vietnam vets, in terms of experiencing the violence, find it inescapable, and those who are only defrauding people at a distance, when they defraud their retirement fund. The chief executives of Enron liquidated their holdings in Enron before it crashed. By executive decree, the lower people on the pecking order at Enron were prohibited from selling their stock in Enron. The executives knew it was going to crash and they got out in time. Now, frankly, the way our banking system is set up, every time there is a balloon, the people with the most information know it's going to pop and have a pretty darn good idea when it's going to pop. It is the people who are believing that the balloon is never going to pop who wind up getting shafted. That happened in 1928, 1929. It happened in 1999. And I can guarantee you, without having the data in front of me, that it happened in 2008. Maybe if there's no blood or physical violence involved, it's easier to live with that bifurcation of your mind. I don't know. But the first episode that I want to talk about is this aircraft with 256 recorded victims, but 258 bodies found at the crash scene. What I have already told you about this crash is what you would have known by reading the newspaper. The next piece of information comes from a man whose name is Charles Byers. Charles Byers was a Navy SEAL who, after his tour of duty in the SEALs, set up a weapons factory that made specialized equipment, and certain pieces of this specialized equipment were sold only to the CIA. And Mr. Byers wrote a letter in 1990 to Porter Goss, who was at that time in charge of the House Intelligence Committee. And he said, I want to bring to your attention certain facts about the crash of Aero Air 1285, and also, by the way, certain facts about the crash of Pan Am 103. Now, unfortunately for Mr. Byers, at this point in time, he was already under indictment. But that's the second part of the story. What Mr. Byers said to Porter Goss was that a friend of mine, also a former Navy SEAL, came to a little museum that I run in Phoenix, Arizona, and looked at some of the specialized equipment I had on display there. And this former Navy SEAL, who was a top-notch guy in the LA bomb disposal squad, said, that's the piece of equipment that blew up Flight 1285. And Charlie said, are you sure? And this guy whose name I don't recall at the moment, not Aaron, but Ariel. I think it was Ariel. Ariel something. He said, I'll have to get permission from the feds to talk about it further, but I'm certain that that's it. 4 weeks later, before Ariel got back in touch with Charlie Byers, Ariel was blown up. Now this is one of the top guys in the LA bomb squad. I think he was the chief of the LA bomb squad. He and his partner on that episode were the only two members of the LA bomb squad to ever be destroyed by an instrument they were attempting to make harmless. What's even more interesting about Ariel's demise is that this bomb was placed in the garage of a union member that had a squawk, a major league argument with his boss. So there was some conflict between the owner of the garage and the employer of the owner of the garage. So Arlie, looking at the device, was confident enough to risk his life and his partner's life because he thought this was an amateur device. I look at it, I think I can disarm it. He and his partner blew up. Not only did they blow up, but the device blew the roof off the garage. It was an amazingly powerful device for an amateurly constructed device. One of the reasons that is interesting is that Arlie had not yet gotten back in touch with Charlie Byers. So a witness to the destruction of Aero Air 1285 was killed before he had the opportunity to tell what he knew about that device. Now, I think I mentioned that Charlie Byers was already under indictment in 1290 when he wrote the letter. He was accused, along with two other Navy SEALs, of defrauding the government out of $103,000. But in that trial, Charlie Byers and one of his partners, the chief witness against them, was a Navy SEAL who was also under indictment and for a reduced sentence agreed to turn state's witness. So you have Charlie Byers, who is discredited by being a convicted felon. You have a witness to the device that was supposedly destroyed the aircraft, eliminated by virtue of being killed. So any testimony that was given to Porter Goss was by definition tainted. Now, did Charlie Byers have real information for Porter Goss? Let me give you some additional information. When 1285 crashed on takeoff, crashing into the ground less than a mile from the airport from which it had just taken off, the official accident report had a majority report and a minority report. The majority report was written by people with no expertise in aviation accident, very little expertise in flying aircraft or the engineering of aircraft. They went along with the official story, which was released, by the way, by the White House press secretary hours after the event, of icing on the wings. The minority reports in accident accounts are very rare, partly because, almost as an unbroken rule, aviation accident reports are thoroughly investigated. Pan Am TWA 800, they reassembled the aircraft piece by piece. Now, the report was wrong even in spite of that, but that's another tale of a government lie. They attempted to do that with Pan Am 103 as well. The point that I am making here is that when you have a minority report, you have a major league difference of opinion between the people who issue the report and the people who disagree with the official finding. The minority report said there is substantial reason to believe that there was a fire on board and possibly an explosion. Witnesses to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police said that there was fire on board, that they could see a fire, they could see the ship on fire as it was going down. Moreover, ordinarily when an aircraft falls so shortly after taking off, especially if it falls because of stalling, the official report, the aircraft is essentially intact. You may have major league damage on fragile subjects inside, like human beings, but the aircraft per se is essentially intact. In this case, people came to the scene and said, "Where's the plane?" Not quite as bad as Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but they asked, "Where's the plane?" Because it was in a multitude of pieces spread out. What I'm describing is two conflicting sets of circumstances. An official story and a group of circumstances that defy explanation via the official story. The family members of the people who died in the crash were not at all satisfied with the official report. So they hired an official investigator. I'm going to call him Taffer, and that's close, but I'm not sure that's it. He interviewed a lot of people, went to the crash site, and although he had a very good history of investigating air crashes per se, none of his notes survived. He died under potentially curious circumstances, but died relatively recently, about 2015 or so. In the course of his investigation, a pathologist was called upon to look at the official records of the corpses of the crash. And in those records it was found that at least 2 passengers were dead before the plane hit the ground. Now remember, I told you there were 258 bodies when there were only 256 listed passengers. Something very strange there. I'll get to Tafford's account of what probably happened in a few moments. Moreover, a third of the bodies of the people who had died in the crash, somewhere between a quarter and a third of them, had carbon monoxide levels that were off the charts. They had been breathing an atmosphere that was high in carbon monoxide for a significant period of time before they died. Now, they died in the crash, strongly suggesting that they were inhaling the results of a fire inside the aircraft, either while it was taking off, while it was in the air for the few seconds, or when it hit the ground. In other words, you've got people dying not of carbon monoxide poisoning, but of having a high enough concentration of carbon monoxide that they would have died if they had survived the crash. They were victims of a fire before they were victims of the crash. What Tafford said in his report to the families before he died under these curious circumstances is that he had gotten rumors and reports that some of the members of the 101st Airborne were in fact special ops who had been bringing back what's called a backpack nuclear weapon that they had been intended to destroy an Iraqi nuclear facility, and that they had aborted the mission either because of their 2 fallen comrades or they had made the discovery. One of the 2 or both. The presumption is that those 2 extra bodies were fallen comrades from the special ops. One thing I didn't tell you is that there were 8 boxes that were loaded in Cairo, that were loaded in the bottom portion of this Boeing aircraft. Those boxes were sufficiently important that the commander of the unit insisted that those boxes get on board in spite of the fact that it required leaving 41 of the duffel bags of the members of the 101st Airborne. So that those 6 or 8 boxes that were the size of coffins were pretty important. Now, if they were in fact coffins, only 2 of the coffins were occupied by corpses. So what's in the other 6 boxes? What Tafford says after that is that the expectation is that the crash was due to CIA personnel destroying the aircraft by virtue of placing a bomb in 1285 while it was on the ground in Gander, Newfoundland. And that it was detonated by remote control after it had gotten in the air. Now, is there any physical evidence to substantiate what Mr. Tafford said in his report? Well, we have the evidence that some of the victims of the crash would have died of carbon monoxide poisoning. We also have the evidence that when 1285 crashed, one of the first people in the United States to be notified was the person in charge of nuclear accidents. And he contacted the nuclear person, the person in charge of nuclear accidents in Newfoundland. And that person participated in the investigation of the crash of 1285. No evidence in the written record as to why anyone connected with nuclear with nuclear weapons or nuclear accidents for involvement of these two persons. Somebody thought that the investigation needed to be headed or at least controlled by a person with nuclear energy expertise. Why? Your guess is probably better than mine. When they investigated the crash, ordinarily, as was the case with Pan Am 800, as is the case with almost all air crashes, you get people with expertise in military accidents, in aircraft accidents, aircraft engineering, and aircraft piloting. In this particular case, a guy with no expertise in aircraft engineering or flying was appointed head of it. And his instructions were not to attempt to reconstruct the aircraft. There was an empty hangar available for getting what parts were available in there. What he did after they retrieved the corpses was order that the aircraft be buried under 6 feet of dirt on site. Very unusual. There is a report that there was a white-hot object about the size of a large grapefruit that burned through the bottom of the aircraft, burned through the body of the corpse of a stewardess, and buried itself in the ground, in spite of having been doused with a fireman's hose. Now, when you douse a very hot object with a hose, it's either going to cool off or it has a source of internal energy. And a subcritical mass of fissile material would be supplying its own energy and therefore would stay hot. What we have are a whole lot of unanswered circumstances that are unanswered by the official story. The unofficial story is that somebody at the CIA wanted to stop a special ops group from getting back into the United States. Why? That special ops group had discovered that they were on a suicide mission. 2 of their members had already been killed, and if the nuclear device had gone off, they discovered, by what means I cannot tell you, that they were going to be part of the disaster. They were not going to escape the detonation of that instrument. And the story is that they were coming back to say, "What the hell are you doing to us?" Now, either Oliver North, on his own authority, because he was head of the Iran-Contra activity, said to his CIA counterpart, "Don't let that aircraft back into the United States airspace," or someone above him, perhaps like George Herbert Walker Bush, who was head of the CIA, who was president at that, no, he was head of the CIA in 1985, said, "I don't want that aircraft in U.S. airspace." Here you have someone wearing the uniform of the United States, be it the CIA or the military, ordering the murder of 256 personnel in order to avoid the embarrassment of having a rogue special ops group saying, "You tried to kill us." Now, I will ask for questions, because I have tried to answer the questions for which there are obvious answers. I am suggesting that Mr. Tafford had a reasonably accurate description of what actually happened, and that the official story had more holes than a sieve, and that you have people treating 256 members of the U.S. military as expendable because their witness would have been embarrassing. I think that comes close to the definition of psychopathy that James Corbett is talking about. Do you have any questions about that dark episode?
Did they say where the weapon was to be detonated and what their target was?
The theory was that it was to be detonated at an Iraqi nuclear station that was at least suspected by the Israelis of being an early stage of nuclear development. But where in Iraq is not stated.
And what was the time frame on this again?
1985. And the aircraft was Aero Air 1285. Aero Air was apparently a charter airline that was frequently used by the CIA for getting people and equipment from here to there. And one of the reasons that was being used in this case, it was being used officially in order to transport the Airborne 101 to the Sinai because it was part of the peacekeeping arrangement, and informally it was being used to transport military equipment back and forth. The Iranians were buying at very high prices American equipment because they were currently at war with Iraq at that point in time, and the CIA was providing armaments for the Contras in Nicaragua. So there was reason for military equipment going back and forth. There was no reason to have a backpack nuke on board, however. Okay. The bright side of the ledger is this. We have talked last year, if I recall what it was, about jury nullification. And one of the really enjoyable things about jury nullification is one of the ways people like you and me can actually fight back against the ruling elite and the power that seems to be arrayed against us. I have a very interesting piece of information for you. Was anyone here, let me ask the question differently. Were all of you born in the United States? Any of you naturalized citizens? You're all natural born citizens. Were any of you born in the District of Columbia or Guam or Puerto Rico? Okay. For purposes of the Internal Revenue Code, you are all non-resident aliens. Now, I bet you thought you were citizens of the United States, didn't you? For purposes of the IRS code, you are non-resident aliens. Why? Because you are not a resident of the United States of America, Inc. The United States of America, Inc. is defined as the District of Columbia and territories of the United States. Territories with a capital T. Territories of the United States currently are Guam and Puerto Rico. Before I think it was 1911, it would have included those few territories out west that had not yet become states. That is the United States of America, Inc. Now, why do you pay income taxes? You didn't know it, but you volunteered. You volunteered when you accepted there are several ways of volunteering. The first way you volunteered was by requesting a Social Security number. The second way you unintentionally volunteered was by not claiming your birth certificate as your property and solely your property. Now, I want to give you, let's see if I can get this up. Because I want to go to the end of this before we get to the beginning. Cheat sheet. Here it is. I am going to use this at least to get started. Now let's go to the, this is from a website that is sponsored by Weiss Paris. The website is weissparis.com. Remember the definition. A resident of the United States is one who was born in the District of Columbia or Guam or Puerto Rico. Or, if Tamita were here, I could get her good and infuriated. The citizenship of liberated blacks at the end of the Civil War was claimed by the United States of America, Inc. So black citizens of the United States of America, their corporate identity is owned by the United States of America, Inc. But that's a somewhat different matter. But let me go to this one. By the way, Joe, I'll need to talk with you because I think we want to have a special program at the library, how to avoid but not evade income taxes.
Weiss and Associates presents IRS Fraud and Presumption. We're told in the scriptures at Exodus 20:16, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." Simply stated, we're told not to lie. However, you've no doubt heard reports that even politicians and government officials lie to American nationals, which is the focus of this video. No one's perfect, and we've all made our share of mistakes, but certainly the vast majority of Americans have never reached the zenith of deception and fraud, as has the national government, regarding the jurisdictional application and lack of liability for Americans with the federal income tax. There are U.S. taxpayers who are subject to the IRC statutes, and this is not the audience we're referring to. However, a vast majority of Americans have, with or without complete knowledge of the ramifications, made a voluntary choice to join the U.S. tax club. With this voluntary election, these Americans are treated as U.S. resident aliens instead of who they actually are, American nationals. Contrary to the Supreme Court's decision in the Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust case, the national government accomplished this feat without providing American nationals full disclosure as to the intentions of what the U.S. Congress was actually achieving.
I will send to each of you the 2 or 3 websites that are important here, because there are at least 2 federal court cases that you don't have to read carefully, but you do need to be familiar with them because they are absolutely determinative on what constitutes a citizen and what constitutes a taxpayer.
Naive acceptance was the outcome of the presumption created by propaganda via the national government against trusting Americans devoid of any willful and knowing intent on their part to subject them to a tax never lawfully imposed upon the private sector population in the constitutional republic. We'll address the fraud and distortions of the truth, twisted by those within the national government by willfully and intentionally misleading Americans in order to formulate their thinking that the federal income tax was levied upon them. For many, the falsehood has been so well established over the last 100 plus years that most Americans are unacquainted with the fraud perpetrated against those who work in the private sector with no taxation nexus with the national government. Here are the pertinent aspects of fraud. 1, intentional perversion of the truth in order to induce another to part with something of value or to surrender a legal right. 2, an act of deceiving or misrepresenting, a trick. Or 3, a false representation of a matter of fact, whether by words or by conduct, by false or misleading allegations, or by concealment of what should have been disclosed, that deceives and is intended to deceive another so that the individual will act upon it to his legal injury. Consider the following truths. The Supreme Court's Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust decision that taxation on incomes is a direct tax under Article 1, Sections 2 and 9, which can only be imposed via the rule of apportionment according to population. Any attempt by the Congress to levy such a tax upon Americans in the constitutional republic, devoid of inclusion of the rule of apportionment, was held by this highest court in the land to be unconstitutional. President William H. Taft, who wrote the legislative intent of the 16th Amendment, urged Congress to pass the amendment, acknowledging that any attempt to create an income tax must include the rule of apportionment. He performed a workaround, framing the new proposal as a tax upon the national government itself. He referred to a tax aimed at those who work for the national government or use some type of federal property, which are both privileges. Now we see IRS propaganda and fraud that emanates from IRS publication 2105. 1. The United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 states, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. This section doesn't deal with income taxation or direct taxation, as did the Pollock decision. Thus, it's a type of misdirection to infer association with the income tax. There are plenty of other taxes which can fund these endeavors. 2. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution states, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. Notice by the wording the avoidance of the rule of apportionment requirement. There has to be 2 United States jurisdictions in order for the 16th Amendment not to violate the Pollock decision, and it's this second jurisdiction that's being addressed. The states referenced describe the District of Columbia and U.S. territories, known as states of the United States. And 3, Congress used the power granted by the Constitution in the 16th Amendment and made laws requiring all individuals pay tax. The federal income tax laws are only levied upon the national government per the legislative intent of the 16th Amendment. The geographical or territorial jurisdiction of the national government is where the federal income tax is only law. As to the second part of the statement, the wording is obviously deceptive, as we all pay tax of some sort, but there is no law requiring every human pay income tax. Most Americans realize that the District of Columbia is not a state of the Union, and never can be, as it's a federal territory reserved for the seat of government. An interesting parallel is the fact that the government calls this geographical jurisdiction the United States, which is intentionally used to create confusion in the minds of Americans who don't dwell daily on matters related to legalese. The IRS then continues on its propaganda journey to draw the unaware into the wrong conclusion by its addressing those Americans living and working in the constitutional republic within private sector employment. The entire dialogue by the IRS fails to even acknowledge the separation and distinction of the constitutional republic in its propaganda to Americans. Fraud must be proved by showing that the IRS actions involve 5 separate elements. 1, a false statement of a material fact. It should also substantially affect a person's decision to enter into a contract or pursue a certain course of action. A false statement of fact that doesn't bear on the disputed transaction won't be considered fraudulent. 2, knowledge on the part of the IRS that the statement is untrue. To be fraudulent, a false statement must be made with the intent to deceive the victim. This is perhaps the easiest element to prove once falsity and materially are proved, because most material false statements are designed to mislead.
Interestingly enough, a lot of IRS individual agents are not aware of this. That is, what they tell you is the law is actually IRS regulations. Joe Bannister, when he asked to see the law warranting income tax, was basically asked to resign. He was not aware of the gyrations through which Congress went in order to establish the income tax law and in order to literally deceive, to fool American citizens into paying a tax that was only justifiably imposed on employees of the federal government or residents of the District of Columbia.
The U.S. Congress knew full well the intention of the Pollock decision. 3, intent on the part of the defendant to deceive the alleged victim. The statute 26 CFR section 1.871-1A shows this. 4, justifiable reliance by the alleged victim on the statement. The victim's reliance on the false statements must be reasonable. Reliance on a patently absurd false statement generally will not give rise to fraud. However, people who are especially gullible, superstitious, ignorant, or illiterate may recover damages for fraud if the defendant knew and took advantage of their condition. And 5, injury to the alleged victim as a result. The false statement must cause the victim some injury that leaves him in a worse position than he was before the fraud. Injury here is in the financial area, as explained in 18 U.S.C. section 1589 A3 and A4, addressing abuse or threatened abuse of law or legal process, and serious harm found in 18 U.S.C. section 1589 C1 and C2. To make this discovery real for you, time is required to engage in your own intellection in order to fully absorb the content and impact that the IRS propaganda has made upon your life. You're a free moral agent. It's up to you to ascertain the facts presented as being truthful by studying the law referenced here. The law is what counts in the final analysis. Many Americans suffer the fear of government and would choose to lick the hands of those who would continue to enslave you, in spite of the fact that the 13th Amendment has outlawed slavery and involuntary indentured servitude in the constitutional republic. Do you live in the land of the free and the home of the brave? Or has that concept of the constitutional republic been tossed into the dustbin of history, and what you envision as America is but a Disney World fantasy? The choice is yours to make, and you're reminded that the U.S. Supreme Court has put the burden upon the American people with its declaration promulgated in the case American Communications Association versus Dowds, where you'll find stated, "It is not the function of our government to keep the citizen from falling into error. It's the function of the citizen to keep the government from falling into error." Thanks for watching. Press the like button if you found this video informative, subscribe to our channel, and follow us on Twitter.
Let's see, I want to get rid of this. I want to show you 3 websites, or not web, oh, let's get this up. Go all the way to the bottom here. I thought I had all 3 of them. I'll send them out to you. You'll have to get on his email list, Lila. There are 3 sites that are particularly interesting, and there are some, this title for the second half of this program, Dawn, should be the greatest gymnasts in the world, because that is precisely what the lawyers have become in terms of writing the amendment and in terms of writing the law, so that it is exceedingly difficult or impossible for the American citizen to find out what his actual legal obligations are. As I say, in terms of the IRS law and regulations, the vast majority of American nationals. By American national, I mean a person who is a resident of a state of the Union. I'm a resident of the state of Iowa. In my younger days, I was a resident of the state of Illinois. I have never been a resident of the United States of America, Inc. Okay? I've never been a resident of the United States of America, Inc. Now, I would have been subject by law to the IRS law and the IRS regulations during that period of time in which I worked for the VA. During that period of time, I was an employee of the United States of America, Inc. And therefore, I would have been obligated to pay income taxes by a matter of law. I don't think I know anybody who is, oh, I do, as a matter of fact, not very well, but I know one person who lives in the United States of America, Inc. And I'm certain that he both pays his income taxes, and I know that he is, in fact, legally bound to. Now, I happen to use the word legally, and that introduces another legal concept of which you will want to be aware if you take this subject seriously and if you choose to go on the attack. Because I consider this an attack on the system in which we are living. There is a difference between that which is legal and that which is lawful. That which is lawful is considered to be the law of the land. Okay? That which is legal is considered to be the law of the sea. When you go into a courtroom, and unfortunately this applies not only to federal courtrooms, but to state and county courtrooms. If there is, this is my understanding of it, and I'm not 100% on the solidest of ground here. If that courtroom has an American flag that is braided in gold or yellow, like stepping onto a ship, you are accepting the jurisdiction of that flag. I'm going to let that soak in. If you are on that ship, you are accepting the jurisdiction of the country of which that flag is identified. So if it's an American warship and flying the American flag, you have submitted yourself to the law of the United States of America. If it's a Russian warship, and this is, you see this in political disputes all the time, whether a member of the U.S. military can lawfully or legally board a vessel flying a Russian flag. Be that as it may, the law of the land applies to the 50 states of the Union of the United States of America. The laws of Iowa are lawful inasmuch as they apply to residents of Iowa. When you walk into a U.S. courtroom, you are walking into another jurisdiction. What is lawful concerns the law of the land. What is legal concerns the law of the sea. The United States of America was established in either 1776 or 1789, kind of depends. I'm sure there's an answer to that, but I'm not 100% certain. The United States of America, Inc. was established in 1871. And the first president of the United States of America, Inc. was Ulysses S. Grant. Are you confused? Good, because you're supposed to be. The whole point of this is to convince you that you have a legal obligation to pay income taxes when you only have a lawful obligation to pay the taxes of the state of which you are a citizen? Tom?
Are you trying to tell us that this is yet another false flag?
It's another deception. If you want to call that a false flag, yes. But I'm not, I think a false flag refers to an event rather than a series of events or a political movement. Dawn?
I think Aaron Russo did a documentary on this shortly before he died. And when that was quoted, what I understood it to say was that IRS investigators, after they had researched this, then quit paying their income tax, which is kind of questionable because it says here people that work for the government are required to pay. But on the other hand, the IRS is not exactly part of the government.
I cannot answer. A, I did not see the Russo film. And B, I will guarantee you that there are events in history and phrasing of the law, both of which are intended to confuse rather than clarify.
So do you think anybody that has fought and won the battle against their personal paying income tax,
Absolutely.
that part
Absolutely.
of that is a gag order?
Then not necessarily. One of the three websites is sponsored by Judge Anna von Reitz. Judge Anna is a state judge of the state of Alaska. And I will send you guys the websites involved. And I am absolutely certain that they've not even been placed under a gag order. It's just that the law is so convoluted, and the punishments for offering tax avoidance advice are so severe that it takes a person with a great deal of self-confidence and a great deal of information to effectively do it. One of the three websites, however, is sponsored by WeissParis.com. They're located in Paris, and it's Weiss Incorporated. Probably Jewish, but that's okay. I'm not worried about that. And they have 1,000 clients, and they charge fees for tax advice. And they have forums online. Judge Anna started researching this in the 1970s. She saw a clip where Nelson Rockefeller was being interviewed as the precursor to him becoming vice president for Jerry Ford. And he was asked in the congressional interview how much income tax, or how much his income was the previous year. And he said, whatever number of millions. Next question was, how much did you pay in income tax? And Nelson Rockefeller said, nothing. And the interrogator said, you mean to say that after having made X number of millions of dollars, you paid nothing in the way of income tax? And Nelson Rockefeller said, nothing. At that point, Judge Anna said, I need to know what Nelson knows. Now, most of us would assume, and partly rightly so, that Nelson can hire the best analysts as to how to protect his money. And that's undoubtedly true. However, when you understand the intentional ambivalence or ambiguity of the tax law and of the 16th Amendment, you don't have to be a billionaire, but you do have to either hire somebody who's pretty smart, like Weiss Incorporated, or like Judge Anna, who's willing to pursue a sufficiently adequate understanding of the law to get down and read. As she says herself, she spent a couple decades reading and getting to the comprehension level of the tax law, which is intentionally obtuse. But yes, now that I have a reasonable grasp of the way that the gymnasts have arranged the gym court, I'm confident that a person who is willing to devote the necessary time and intelligence can evade, not avoid, but evade, no, I've got that backwards. Can legally avoid payment of income tax without illegally evading income tax. Tom?
So essentially what,
Populars.
so essentially what this is a hidden loophole that people like the Rockefellers know about and the average people don't know about.
I don't know if you call it a loophole. It is, in the phrasing of the amendment, it is intentionally deceptive to the American public, and it is intentionally not in conflict with the original Constitution.
Well, what I'm getting at is why would they do that? Are they creating a loophole that only people?
They're
like Rockefellers know
creating
about?
a mechanism by which they can deceive the American public.
Why would they, I mean, there would need to be a purpose in order to create a loophole, I'm presuming, but.
Well,
Just creating more work for the lawyers. I mean, the lawyers and the.
it's creating more work for the lawyers, but more appropriately, it's establishing in a lawful fashion a law that is technically legal and lawful, but is so easily misconstrued so that it applies not to 5% of the American population, but to 70% of the American population. I don't care if you call that a loophole. It's a it's a magician's trick. But the magician is intending to trick you to entertain you. The U.S. federal government is intending to trick you in order to defraud you. Call it a loophole if you will.
Well, a loophole, the intent is to exempt wealthy people who have inside knowledge and dupe the rest of Americans in order to get them to volunteer their money.
Well, it doesn't take vast wealth, but it takes either vast wealth or time and intelligence to get around it. I don't have vast wealth, but I'm beginning to understand it. I'm going to read Pollock, and I'm going to read some of these court cases so that I have a better understanding of maritime law versus the law of the land. That's a key element. So that I understand who are the residents of the United States of America, Inc. Because as I said, it is not only people who live in the D.C. and or people who work for the federal government. It's also the descendants of black slaves. Very interesting. So I want to find out about those exceptions. Yes, Tom?
Okay, you mentioned corporations when you mentioned the black population, but how about what we call corporations now?
I don't
As far
understand
as
the question.
taxation.
Pardon?
Do corporations, as we think of them now, owe taxes?
Because
Are
they're
they-
Corporations owe taxes to other corporations.
How about, okay, should I have said income tax? How would you see what you have presented today affecting Walmart, say?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because Walmart is an incorporated corporation, and a corporation pays tax to corporation. That is maritime law, by the way.
So what corporation would Walmart be paying taxes to if it is paying taxes?
Almost certainly it's paying taxes both to the United States of America, Inc. and to Iowa, Inc. Because Iowa is an incorporated state. In fact, you live in an incorporated city. Or perhaps you don't.
Well, I don't, but
Okay.
yeah.
But anyone who lives in Iowa City, anyone who lives in an incorporated village, town, or city, lives in a corporation.
So is that how city taxes are appropriated, through that incorporation of the city?
No.
So we'd have to find out about the state. So there must be a
Well, I
document
know the
somewhere
state
that
of
says
Iowa
Iowa
is
is a
incorporated
corporation.
as a corporation. I know Iowa City and Cedar Rapids and almost any named town. There are a few towns in Iowa, and I know there are a few towns in Wisconsin that list themselves as unincorporated. But the assumption is, for a variety of legal reasons, there are protections that a corporation acquires that an unincorporated entity does not. There are privileges that an unincorporated entity have, but there are also obligations. In fact, one of Judge Anna's essays is, if you understand nothing else, unincorporated equals sovereign. So an unincorporated village is totally responsible for its obligations and the exercise of its privileges. Once you incorporate, you accept privileges and obligations as a corporation.
In your reading, did you run across, is it possible or legal to obtain a land patent so the person is able to actually own their property as opposed to holding a warranty?
My preliminary information on that is yes, but you have to jump through, you have to be another gymnast. But if you take possession, it is possible for an individual person, human being, to take personal possession of their personal corporation. But unless and until you do, that personal corporation is public property.
And subject to tax as well.
Yep. I'm going to pursue this, and then that.
Well, I'm glad you're doing this because it's a little over my pay grade.
Can someone tell me the difference between a labyrinth and a maze? Superficially, they look a great deal alike.
Perhaps a labyrinth.
Pardon me?
Perhaps a labyrinth is a directed series of pathways, and a maze is just a blur, so to speak.
That's one way of describing it. A labyrinth is intended to take you on a long pathway and bring you out wiser. A maze is intended to entrap you within itself. That probably doesn't... Yeah, that is a fairly decent definition as I think about it. But they look a lot alike, don't they?
Yeah.
And the tax law is a maze. It is not a labyrinth. It's possible to get through it.
Yeah.
But...
Yeah.
But people have been talking about the legality of having that for quite a few years, right? I mean, even that
legality of what?
Of having an income tax.
Oh, yeah. And
they've been talking about that for.
And there have been several challenges to it, and there is a reason that each of the challenges have failed. Let me give you an example. The 16th Amendment is said to never have been legally or lawfully passed, voted on.
That's what I heard maybe too, yeah.
But the lawful response to that is the income tax doesn't depend on the 16th Amendment. It depends on the definition of the United States as the United States of America, Inc. And the IRS code and the IRS rules are understood to be, and they probably in some places write it, but they are understood to be talking about the United States of America as a corporation. And as a corporation has the privilege of taxing the members, its citizen. But the only citizens of the United States of America, Inc., as defined in 1871, were residents of territories and freed black slaves. And the only territories that are left now, since the western states have become states, is the D.C., Guam, and Puerto Rico.
Do other countries, I'm thinking about my kids in Serbia, I don't think they pay income tax. Do other countries?
Have an income tax? I cannot answer that. They have a multitude of ways of taxing, but the whole idea, if you think of the United States government as initially representing we the people, somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes after it was signed and accepted by the states, it stopped being an expression of we the people and started becoming an expression of we the elite. That's, I think, it's being generous to give it 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
So now I can't sleep tonight now after listening to this.
What I will do in order to make your night even less sleepful is send Joe the 3 web addresses so that you can start researching this on your own. But one of the things I like about this class is that there are other people who recognize the enormity of the evil that we are looking at, but who are willing to spit in the eye of at least a part of that evil. And like jury nullification, this is one place where we can lawfully spit in the eye of the corporation.